Hello, good morning. Hi, Charles. Welcome to Evergreen.
How are you?
I'm all right. We're all
Good.
right. Glad to see you. I'm actually in a classroom with two programs. This is a first.
No,
So
it's good. It's good. It's
we
good.
used to be in person.
Yeah, no, it's
Now we're
good.
on Zoom, and now we're in the classroom with two programs. So we have, and a program here is a full-time educational opportunity. It's not classes. We
Right.
integrate everything together. So we have medium and message, and they're working with ethnographies. And then we have art time and animation and painting, and we are working with animation and painting.
Okay,
And we're
nice.
thinking about, we're doing collaborations between the programs and thinking ultimately of doing animations of personal stories from the ethnography program. So this is where we're headed.
I love it.
For all of you who are joining us, I just want to tell you about the upcoming, I'm Shaw Osha, I'm teaching in art time. And we are upcoming today. We are lucky to have Charles Edwards coming from, I believe, South Carolina.
Well, I'm originally from South Carolina, Georgetown, South Carolina, but I live in Durham, North Carolina.
All right. Okay.
Currently. So,
Great.
yeah.
Okay. So North Carolina, Durham.
Yes.
And we're talking to us all the way in Olympia.
Nice.
And we'll hear more about Charles in a minute. In week 4, we've got Neely Ganyatsky, who's the visitor here in animation, and she'll talk about her work.
We've got to set it up so the audio comes through the system here.
Hold on 1 second.
That's the settings that we played with the other day.
All right, maybe I'll do that in 1 second. Okay. And then in week 6, we have Sean Negus, who is a writer and writes in the expanded field of poetics and translation in Portuguese and English, and does artist books, transmedia, performativity, and collaboration. And then in week 8, we have Elizabeth Chin, anthropologist, and wrote an autoethnography that we are reading, The Life of Things. Our programs are reading it, as is a third program, reading parts of it. And she's currently working in a design center as an anthropologist, so she's an interesting person. Nice. So I'm going to bring up Parker Wong, who's going to introduce you to our audience. So Parker, will you come up and make an introduction?
Hello, my name is Parker Wong. I'm from Charlotte, North Carolina. I use he, him pronouns and am a senior currently enrolled in art time and animation and painting, a class focused on experimental animation and ways to convey emotive visual narratives. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming a fellow artist from the Carolinas, Charles Edward Williams. Williams received his Bachelor of Fine Arts degree from Savannah College of Art and Design and his master's from the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. Williams was also an artist in residence at the McColl Center of Art and Education, which I frequently visited as I was growing up in Charlotte. He is a receiver of the Riley Institute Diversity Leadership Award and recently the Andy Warhol Foundation for Visual Arts grant. Williams's oil paintings juxtapose deep shadows with highly saturated colors, giving many of them the vibrancy of screen prints. Figures depicted with an eerie level of realism bloom from patches of color and abundant negative space to form powerful compositions. Together, these qualities endow Williams's paintings with a unique air of biblical grandeur. Please join me in welcoming Master of Values, Charles Edward Williams.
We have an audience.
I love it. I love it. I love it. I'm drinking my water here. Thank you so much for that intro. My mom always said, never serve people leftovers. We all want, we all should have fresh food. And so I generally, when I do presentations, I speak from my heart. But I want to go ahead and see if possible we could share my website. I've got 2 websites. The first one is CEW Land and Sea. Okay. There you go. So this is my landscape works. And if you scroll down or hit view work, coming from the Carolinas, it is the landscape, the environment is very serene, very open, very vast. I grew up on the river, Black River, which is the longest river in South Carolina. And I spent a lot of times growing up with my parents, walking down the river, walking through the woods, and just observing, picking up sticks, throwing them in the river, looking at animals that were in the woods. And over time, what I realized is that I was actually sharpening my observational skills, which was very important, or is very important, in regards to documenting information and recording information with various mediums. So all those times of, looking out my window, whether it was in my room or actually going outside and drawing trees or drawing the rocks and drawing the birds, I realized very early on and quickly that I could create my own world. I was able to tap inside myself to visualize and create something out of nothing. I was able to share with, my brothers and my grandparents and my mom and dad, hey, look what I did. And tried to do it as very as realistic as possible. So in South Carolina, in the Carolinas, you'll see the marshscape, the marshland, the pluff mud, which is a very sort of like quicksand, but very soothing at the same time. So my mom, she used to take me to go yard sailing. So on Saturday mornings, we would go. She'd say, if you get up with me at 6 o'clock in the morning and take me to go and go yard sailing with me, I'll get you something. And my mom was, she was the type of person that she liked doing things her own. She liked sewing and building things and creating things, finding antique furnitures. So every time, she knew that I love art, drawing and painting. So every single time that I went with her on Saturdays to go yard sailing, she would buy me books. And so she bought me my first book by Andrew Wyeth. And Andrew Wyeth, what I found out later on with his work, he would, work in watercolor and grout, but he was able to, taught from his father, he was able to capture the landscape. And more importantly, not only just capture the landscape, his observational skills that he continued to sharpen through his father's leadership, he was able to capture the spirit of the landscape. He was able to capture the spirit, in essence, of the community and people that live there. And so I would sit on the floor and for hours and hours study his work and to try to replicate it as best as I could. And so that led me to have sort of this curiosity, or sort of this exploration and questioning myself. Well, if I can create my own world and to be able to draw different objects within nature, or different elements of nature, whether it's a tree, whether it's a branch, whether it's all of the aspects that we see, if I'm able to create that and reflect that on paper, what else can I do? Like, what if I was a butterfly? What will my world look like? What if I was an ant? What would my world look like? What if I was a cat? And so asking myself these questions and putting myself mentally in that mindset of what would my perspective look like, I started looking at landscape differently. I started exploring it and investigating it in a way that typically is a non-traditional, in a non-traditional method, where you have the sky, the horizon line in the foreground. For me, it was, where can I do, instead of, sitting in a chair, why not paint the landscape laying on my stomach? Why not paint the landscape kneeling? Why not paint the landscape laying on my side? Why not go into the marsh grass and paint the landscape and see that perspective? And then I started taking it further of putting the camera into the various positions and the various perspectives and capturing the landscape there. And so I later, went on to school, went to SCAD and, sharpened my my skills even further. But I was really interested in advertising and the aspects of the psychology of how psychology is used to influence people to do certain things, whether it's to buy certain things or color choices, etc. And so I graduated from Savannah College of Art and Design with that. And then later on went to grad school. And along the from my undergrad to graduate school, I started studying history, like who were other artists in history that captured the landscape? Who were artists from history that was so passionate about the passion of exploration? Who were those artists? And so I came across the Hudson River movement and the founders, Frederick Church, Durand, Thomas Cole, and they explored the landscapes. And what they were able to do is to go out into the landscape without, in the early 1900s, without any use of the camera, and to document literally the landscape. So if it was a leaf, they would do a study in grout or watercolor and oil painting, and then take that, or they would make color swatches and they would write notes, along the studies. And then they would take all of that information and then take it and bring it back into the studio and then make their final masterpiece, their final painting. So with that information, they were able to show viewers, others, that this actually exists because of, the lack of, technology back then. And so I continued to ask myself, put myself back into that childlike state of what are the questions that I should be asking or need to ask to explore the landscape or the subject, as well as myself? And how do I fuse and look inwardly to share or communicate an authentic message for what's going on today? And so if you go to charlesedwardwilliams.com, and let's start with self. So all of those questions I was able to sort of ask myself, I realized that I sort of hit on something, so I'm a foodie. So I never saw my mom, I love her cooking, but I never saw her use like a recipe book, a cookbook, notes or anything. And my dad would always, he would, if my mom made something, and especially his favorite, he would come by and say, honey, you put your foot in this one. And for me, it was, why do you say that? So there were certain things that I heard growing up of sayings, that people would say. And from that comment that my dad would say, in regards to my mom's cooking, she cooked from the heart, she cooked from the soul. It was very authentic. And so that whole process of investigation led me to, okay, well, how can I make this as a sort of recipe? What's my own version of recipe for how I can communicate? And after doing more studying, I started saying to myself, why not start with myself? I think the best, most influential and informative message and sort of investigation that we can do as artists, as creatives, is to start to look inward. And so I started looking at some of the things that, trouble me, or some of the traumatic events that I've had in my upbringing, or in my, childhood, during my childhood. And so I've had 3 drownings. And I always, going back to those sayings, coming from the South, I would hear, certain negative connotations. And so I started investigating that. I started exploring that. And the same way that I was able to look at the Hudson River movement and the founders and that process and their process of investigation, the same way that they were able to do that, I was able to take that and utilize that for myself. So how can I document and study myself? If you hit the next image, and these are portraits that I've painted of me. And so within those, and with that investigation, I said, well, I'm a Black man from the South. He grew up on the water. I grew up on the water, and I don't know how to swim. And it is my lifelong mission to, before I die and leave this earth, to learn how to swim. And what I found out is that, you can hit the next one. You can go through them all. What I found out is that as I painted myself, how can I go further than just painting myself? Well, I started thinking about the emotions. And so if I'm learning how to swim, what sort of mechanisms and devices do I use? And so I looked at the floaties and I looked at the goggles. And so I continued to explore and continue to paint myself and thought, well, wow, this is something here. I think I got something, because what I'm doing is I'm sharing, I'm being vulnerable and I'm being transparent as a adult, sharing my fears of having panic attacks when I'm in the ocean for about 15 minutes or in different bodies of water. And I'm buried in all by taking my shirt off and saying, this is who I am. This is something that I'm fearful of. And this is something that I'm also curious about. And so I'm also, so I'm the thing that I'm showing you when you look at these paintings is that here is a well-painted portrait, but it's a little bit deeper. And the reason why it goes deeper is because, what am I showing? You know, what are the pieces what are the questions that I'm posing for you to navigate through? You know, what sort of journey, what sort of exploration, what sort of narrative that is being presented to you? And again, you see these kid-like floaties against this, you know, naked body. Again, how cool would it be if we were transparent and vulnerable in our everyday life and people that we don't even know? Think about the effect and impact of our world and how that would be. And so after doing that series, I said to myself, you know, I don't want to try to be like another artist. I'm not trying to paint like someone else. I'm not trying to copy. I'm just trying to be transparent. And it was actually therapeutic. You know, I felt like I was studying my own history, studying me. And so so you can, if you would please, Raul, go to the night section. So going back to those sayings that I would hear growing up, I would, you know, hear various adults saying, don't go swimming at night. And I always like wondered, like, why? Like, why do people say things without, you know, giving any explanation? And so growing up in the South, it was either, you know, if you asked a question, it was either the response was either in a story, or it was either, you know, like a one-liner, you know. And so I wanted to investigate some of those sayings. And so it led me to go to the ocean at night. And so what I did is I said, you know what, the same way that I was able to put myself in a childlike state mentally to pose questions like I did as a child when I was out in the landscape drawing and painting it, I wanted to do the same thing in regards to, you know, the ocean at night. I mean, we all have seen the ocean and water, bodies of water, daytime and nighttime, but what does the nighttime bring and offer? And so for me, it was literally taking my camera, you know, and having someone with me, but taking my camera and taking a flashlight, going out into the ocean, waist deep, and doing 360 turns in the water. And what I said to myself is that this is me as an adult self going back and studying me as a child. And the thing is too, like sometimes I would, you know, my brothers and I, we would take a flashlight walking through the woods with my mom and my dad and shine the light on the water. So this is literally me going back into my own history, my own experiences, and sharing them publicly. And so I was also thinking that this is me, you know, finding the monster that haunts me, you know, the monster that would be under my bed, but in this case, the monster that gives me panic attacks and getting anxiety when I'm in large body of water. And I still, even now when I talk about it, I still get choked up. But the beautiful thing is that I think is that the transparency and the vulnerability and the aspect that I'm brave enough to uncover stories of myself to share with others, because we all have stories. And within those stories, that's when we find connectivity, I believe. We can even go back into history and look at the stories that were shared and told. And there's always a lesson. There's always the goodness that can be found. And so after I did those, I said, well, what else can I explore? What else can I look at? And I started thinking about the history, as African American. What I started thinking about, okay, well, what are some of the narratives and the stories that I wish I would have learned in school that I'm now learning as an adult? And this was back in 2016. I was in graduate school. There was a huge influx of police brutalities going on against African American males. And I said, I started again going back to the process of investigation, asking myself questions. I sort of look at it now, when I talk about my process, which I'm very transparent with. I look at it as I'm like a mad scientist. I'm so passionate about sometimes, I'll go to bed and try to turn my brain off, but I'm still, trying to figure out those questions and trying to find the best way to do it. And so I'm mad about it. I'm crazy about it. I am excited about it. And so each series that I create looks different. And for me, I say to myself, going back to what my mom said, you never want to serve people, cold food, or you never want to serve people leftovers. And so what I like to do is I like to let I want to let the content drive the aesthetics of the works. And so 2016, with the unfortunate that we had a lot of police shootings against African Americans, I started looking at, well, who back in history, art history, was able to document the sign of the times and do it in a way that he or she was able to pose their own questions, like I was able to pose questions for myself. And Goya, he was able to do that with documenting the Spanish War. So what I was able to do was I looked at his etchings, and what I learned is that there were a couple of things that he was able to do. One of the things that he was able to do is to show religious iconography. The other thing is that he was able to establish movement within his etchings. And then the third thing that he was able to do is he was able to place his own views, and he was able to create his own sort of hierarchy of what the viewer, what he would want the viewer to ask, or to see, or to potentially see, or the what if. So technically how he would do that, maybe the perpetrator would be, in white instead of black, or in shadow. Maybe the victim would be in shadow, and then the perpetrator was would be in white. So I started thinking about going back to those sayings. How do I document this series that I'm trying to convey about, the police shootings in 2016? So I used those ways of thinking that Goya did with these oil paintings on watercolor paper and some on Mylar. And, I was very fortunate from doing this body of work. The North Carolina Museum of Art came to my studio and collected these for their permanent collection. But another way that I was authentically able to go about choosing these, so I was able to think, again, going back to sayings that I heard growing up. My grandfather, he couldn't read or write, and he was half Cherokee and half white. And so, he told me and my brothers growing up, you always want to look a man or a woman in their eye, shake their hand firmly. because when you do that and you keep your word, what you do is establish trust. And my grandfather was able to have a very successful life without being able to read and write. And so I said to myself, wow, okay, well, what symbolizes trust, in our society today? So I thought about the hand, the use of the hand. When you shake a man or a woman's hand firmly, you're acknowledging them, you're showing them respect, you're showing them gratitude, and which equals trust. And so I was looking at riots in history from the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, and looking at those stocked black and white photographs, and I was selecting them to paint from by the use of the hands. And so that's how I was able to say, okay, this is the one I want to paint, or it could be facial expressions. And there were sometimes what I was able to do, like Goya was able to do with his etchings, where I was able to, sometimes I would, if I was looking at, if it was a police officer looking at the victim, I changed his, angrily, aggressive expression into a more curious, look. I looked at the use of the hands and said, well, instead of fully rendering the use of the hands, why not leave them white? When I think about being held and captive, restrained, as an African American, and seeing what has happened historically, that is sort of a psychological sort of lynching, a sort of white rope. And so those are just some of the choices that I was able to make within this series. Let's go to Everyone Loves the Sunshine. So Everyone Loves the Sunshine, I started thinking about, okay, again, going back to the questions and I don't draw or sketch anymore. I actually write when I start my process. So I started thinking, it was election time. It was gearing up for election time after, 2017, 18. And I saw that just in my neighborhood, in my community, and talking to various people, that there was this sort of tension amongst society and the world. And I started thinking, like, how can we as individuals find a place of reprieve? How can we sort of find a place of rest? And then I started asking myself the question, like, well, what does that look like for me? And what it looks like is those innocent, quiet childhood moments of when my mother would buy me the books, the art books, and I would sit there on the floor by the fireplace for hours and hours and hours and just draw and just explore and try to copy exactly what I saw, because I was fascinated that someone was able to create this, right? And so I started looking at childlike expressions, and I started thinking, okay, I started researching, like, were there any experiments done where children, African-American children, were, being tested? And there was in the 60s. And then I started thinking about, okay, well, what were some of the medium? What were some of the materials that I was able to use as a child? So this particular piece right here is one of my favorite pieces, because my grandmother, she every Friday she would go to Piggly Wiggly, which is a grocery store in the Carolinas. If you're from the Carolinas, you'll know what Piggly Wiggly is, but it's a grocery store. And every Friday she would go with her friends and get groceries, and she would always bring me back art supplies. And one of the art supplies that she would get me is a scratch pads. So where you have these sort of square, black blocks where the crayon is underneath, and different colors are underneath in wax, but then like the I guess it's acrylic paint on top, and they have a tool and you can scratch through and see the color. And I love those. So I would sit by my grandmother's feet and or sit beside her, and she would be watching soap operas. And after soap opera, she'd have a list of shows that she would watch, but I would sit there and just draw. I would even try to draw the actors on TV, or it was either I was sitting there drawing her. But again, what it did for me is that it brought me back to a place of peace, a sense of freedom, a place of exploration. So these squiggly lines and marks, what I learned and from my history is that, certain marks that were made by children were identified as, trauma marks or hopeful marks. And so, and I don't have to get into that, but I copied those marks on my own, and then was able to sort of dial in personally within my own trauma experiences that I've had to express myself, and started out the series with those mark making. And then I was also thinking about color. So this leads me to, my grandmother and her saying, honey, stay in the light. You got to stay positive, stay in the light. And she knew that there were times I would get frustrated if I couldn't draw something right, or frustrated, if I didn't want to do something, in regards to my parents. My grandmother was the one that taught me how to love. And she was the one that really helped me be able to express myself in a way that was authentic, in a way that was, she was able to understand me, I'll say that. And with her influence, I was able to draw back from those precious, tender moments and said, okay, well, what does everyone like to do? When people get together, what is the commonality? And so one of the things I started thinking about is those precious times of having cookouts, hot summers in the Carolina, and barbecue and hot dogs and, Kool-Aid and all those different things that I remembered growing up. But what I also thought about is everyone likes being outside. Everyone enjoys nature for the most part. And so I came up with a series called Sun and Light, because I was thinking about sun, in regards to spirituality, and hearing my mother being one of 10 kids. Her father was preacher, Baptist. It was, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. And then I was thinking, okay, well, sun, the actual sun. And so the different connotations with that. And then light, thinking about my grandmother and her saying to me, hey, stay in the light, stay in the light. So I wanted to pay homage to my grandmother in regards to, that positivity that she kept during the 60s, during, race relation times, and high race relations. And because I was always thinking to myself, she was a nurse. I was thinking, and she also baked too. And I just said to myself, how is she able to find the joy in things in life? But it was her, it was her thinking, her mindset. So I started studying color and thinking about the actual sun, and then the literal sense of sun. And what does the sun look like? When we think about the sun and draw the sun, what does it represent, and what color is used? And so I started looking at the psychology. I started looking at the color yellow and the psychology of yellow. And I started thinking also too, how is yellow used in our society today? And so when you see it, it's used, for caution tape and happy face and school bus. So there's these various sort of human-like emotions that is associated with the color yellow. And then I started thinking about, well, who in history studied color in a way that I would like to study. And so Joseph Alpert's did that with the students. He was able to have them test color and see how they were affected by when colors were put side by side. And so what I did is I went through stock black and white historical photos and started reappropriating them. And I started studying not only the psychology of yellow, but other colors and what they meant. And so I would go through these photos and strategically place these colors in the paintings. And so again, looking at something that was documented from history, but then moving it forward and bringing it to the present, but also still coming from an authentic place. You know, where would I like in the photo, in from the looking at the photograph, but then yet painting, where would I like the color to be placed? And what does the color represent and emphasize? So sky blue, spiritual healing, purple, religion, red, pink, love, green, growth, and so on. This is another cool piece because I started looking at, okay, well, how can I take my process even further without painting? And so I started looking at some of my toys and seeing, you know, and this is when like a huge influx of Marvel movies were coming out. So I said, I want to represent my superheroes. Like, who are my superheroes? And so I started thinking about the power that they had. You know, I like Wolverine and Spider-Man, Iron Man. But I started thinking about going back to history, again, paying homage to my grandmother in the 60s. Who were some of her heroes? You know, who were the heroes? And so going back to the terms that I always would hear behind every, and one of those would be behind every good man is a strong woman. So I said, well, how can I pay homage to my grandmother if she's no longer with me? And what person or group stood by strong men? Because I didn't, and then the other thing is, if I can find this story, this narrative, was it taught to me in school? And I came across the Freedom Rides. And there were a group of men and women who stood together to travel from the north to the south for equality and justice. And they stood for that cause. So they would take buses down to the south and rally and protest, and but do it in a peaceful manner to try to educate those who were against equality, that we are equal and that it is important for us to be as one. So I started saying, okay, well, what I'll do is I'll highlight these women. And so I started looking at the Freedom Rides and looking at the mugshots of the men and women, but decided to paint the mugshots of the women. I started thinking to myself, these are the superheroes. You know, they stood by strong men willing to risk their life for a greater cause, which is what the Avengers and our Marvel comic book fan, you know, those who are Marvel comic book fans, what they represent. But the way that I was able to do this, and this led me to winning and receiving the Andy Warhol fellowship grant. What I was able to do, what I thought about is, again, and along the way, I've sort of developed this sort of like a recipe. How can I, and when I create a series, can I do it from an authentic place? That's number one. Number two, can I reflect the signs of the time? That's number two. Number three, what story or narrative can I go back and look at for context and history? And then number four, who in the art canon was able to do that for their sign of the times? And so it's a four-step process that I've been using ever since this series, because what I've been able to do, what I've been able to see is that from having dialogue and discussion, that people are actually understanding further and deeper connectivity. And I'm even able to see it from within my own self, that there's a lot of historical stories that aren't being shared. And I've made it my mission to go about uncovering those. So going back to this series, looking at the portraits, I said, well, Andy Warhol was able to show the signs of the times. He wasn't able to meet Marilyn Monroe, but what he did is he reflected the period and era that she lived. And so he repeated her image over and over and over. And so I said, I wanted to do the same thing. So his process was screen printing first, then painting on top. Well, I said, okay, Charles, how can you insert yourself into the canon? And what I decided to do is paint first and then create the aesthetics of screen printing. So when you look at screen printing prints, you zoom in, you see the little dots of color and the negative spaces. And so I was able to, as best as I could, create those. And what I later on discovered is that what I'm doing is, I said to myself, well, Charles, you're literally excavating, like you're showing the literal process of excavating, and you're excavating your own history, because these are stories and narratives that weren't taught to you in school. And that's why you find it fascinating to find these stories, to want to share with people, because your excitement and your fascination that this wasn't shared, that comes across as passionate. And we all love when someone, again, is passionate about what they do, which goes back to me seeing all of those precious moments where my mother cooked a meal, and a lot of times she would cook and wouldn't eat because she was cooking for others. She was cooking for the family. And my dad would say, honey, you put your foot in it. I was able to, I was asked to look at, since I've been looking at narratives and stories from history, I was able to, Alice Dunbar Nelson, she's a writer, American writer, and half Black and half Creole. I'm sorry, half white and Creole. Her mother was Creole, her father was white, and she wanted so bad to become a well-known writer. She loved writing, loved fishing, loved doing sort of those non-traditional household type chore things. She was very ambitious in this way, but she always felt like there was this sort of glass ceiling that, people would affirm her in her writing, but she wasn't able to get the acclaim, the notoriety that she felt like men were getting during her time. And so the Delaware Museum of Art asked me to do a series of paintings and works of her. And so I went up there and went through all her archives, all the writings, and these are those pieces. And so, like I said before, I have like this passion, this drive to find all of the hidden stories that haven't been told and shared. And they eventually collected a piece for their permanent collection. Warm water, again, looking at my own experiences of dealing with trauma, I was at one of my exhibitions, and a woman came up to me and she said, I love your work, but I think this will be interesting to you. And what she did is she handed me a dissertation written by William Tuttle, and it was in regards to the 1919 Chicago race riot. And from reading it, what I learned is that the race riot in Chicago in 1919 it started from a water accident. And when I continue to read further, there were 5 boys, 5 teens, and they were on this man-made raft. They built this raft. They were first in an unsolicited area, so they weren't supposed to be there. And they were trying to go to their side of the lake. And in this area where they shouldn't have been, there was an ice company and a brewing company, and they were pumping out chemicals into the water. During that time, if any African-American would go into that body of part of the water, it would temporarily bleach their skin. So they took that risk and they got on this boat. And the reason why they did that is because they were trying to dodge the Irish that were in the neighborhood. So during that time, African Americans were moving heavily up to the north because they wanted, better pay wages. And so they had to look for places to live. And a lot of times they were looking into the Irish neighborhoods, and the Irish didn't want them there. So, there was this tension on top of, racial tensions elsewhere. So there was a white Irishman these 5 teens were on this raft, and there was a white Irishman, white man throwing rocks at these kids, and the kids thought it was a game, but unfortunately, the leader of the 5 teens, Eugene Williams, which I thought was fascinating. His last name is Williams, so my name is Williams, and it's like, here's this sort of this water association that he and I have, and I've never met him, but being fascinated with the story, I said, this is something I have to share, and that's the dissertation there. So eventually, unfortunately, Eugene Williams drowned, being hit by a rock, and so the other 14s eventually got to their side of the lake and told parents and other community members, and it caused an uproar on the lake, and police officers were involved, and then one of the police officers accidentally shot a Black member, and so that caused a big uproar and riot, and there you have the Chicago race riot. And so these are examples and images of the works. This piece here that you're seeing, my father was like, he would always say, I don't want you gambling, I don't want you learning how to play cards. But every time I would go to my grandma's house, I would ask and beg my cousin to teach me how to play spades and how to play poker, how to play, card games. But so for me, it wasn't about the actual cards. It was about me taking chance, and so when I started thinking about that, with me taking a chance of doing something that was forbidden, don't play cards, it was me thinking about the life, that was taken from, the kids. And as well as, as African Americans, how we have that sort of stigma that we sort of face daily. So I think I'll end with the series Black River. So again, all of these come from, they all come from an authentic place first and primarily. And I was thinking, what else can I share? And for me, when I make art, it's very, it's informal, but it's also, I'm inquisitive about it. And I'm also transparent. And so I wanted to investigate the dynamic between my mother and my father and me. My father was, military, spent 40 years in the military, PTSD, being involved with the Vietnam War. My mother, one of 10, preacher's daughter, I had this juxtaposition growing up in the house where, there was these rules and principles from a Christian standpoint, but then yet there was the juxtaposition was the sort of a social sort of abrasive construct that I had to follow that didn't match with Christian views. So I dealt with 13 years of abuse with my father, but then yet having these values, having these laws, having these rules that I had to abide by, given by my mother. And so what I realize is that as I'm learning myself, as I'm, continuing to investigate myself, I didn't have a place to sort of release that tension or release or even forgive myself. And I said to myself, wouldn't it be awesome if we looked inside ourselves and really forgave those who perpetrated against us, or who abused us, or who used us, or who have hurt us? Like, what does that look like? And how can I best show forgiveness? And so the series Black River is me acknowledging and showing radical forgiveness. And the title Black River, as I said earlier, comes from me growing up on the Black River. My parents, they still have their house there. And so I said, if I'm going to work on this for forgiving my father for the 13 years of physical and psychological abuse, then, as well as my mother too, then what does it look like? So I started going through some of the parables and sort of the narratives and stories, just like I did with other series, and started looking at those stories and seeing, okay, how can I express myself? And so I looked at the story where Peter in the Bible, Peter was asking Jesus, how many times do you forgive your brethren? And Jesus replied 7 times 70. And so what I did is I said, well, I'll just take the multiplication of 7 and use that as an example. So I ripped out I bought a whole bunch of Bibles and ripped out the 7 pages of when Peter asked Jesus, how many times you forgive your brother? And for me, what I got from him was Jesus was saying to us as Christians, as followers, we should forgive every single day. And what I learned is that if we do forgive, doesn't mean we forget, but if we do forgive, we're releasing and letting go. And when we do hold on, we're only hurting ourselves. This piece here, which is what I love, this is called A Measure of a Man. So what I did is I measured my father in height, and the height of the Bibles, the stack of the Bibles is the same height as him. And the black Bibles represent before Christ, before he was saved, and then the white is after Christ. And again, color associations as well. And so this is, and then I also wanted to create a sanctuary, because my first museum show, when I was showing you earlier my self work of me acknowledging myself of not knowing how to swim as African American, and how I felt ashamed about that, and I hid that, in my teenage years. What I learned is that at my first show, when I was being open and transparent, people were coming up to me, hugging me and crying and sharing their own experiences of water accidents or joyous times that they had. I mean, I had one woman tell me that she doesn't swim today because her father would throw her off the bridge and then make her brothers go get her. So again, it was another example of saying, wow, Charles, people have all of these stories and narratives within them that they really want to share. And at the end of the day, we just want to connect. We just want to be able to have our voices heard. So going back to Black River, I started thinking about, the same process that I did of drawing the nature and painting the landscape. How do I do the same? How do I take that same process and put that into different mediums? So this here is a video that I did of me literally, instead of looking at this, I looked at the story in the Bible where John baptized Jesus. So instead of me literally baptizing my father, like John was able to baptize Jesus, my father actually, after 13 years, became a preacher. And so I took his sermons and showed a video baptizing the sermons in the water. And so you'll see here, with all the series and all the works, it's about, again, using myself. For me, it's about, showing my truest self to hope, in hopes to, inspire. Oh, this is cool too. I think it's cool. This piece here, I took 7 statements out of the Bible. And what I did is I printed them on black paper, embossed them or debossed. And what I was able to do is I ripped them. And the way that I was ripping them was I was looking at the shape of the river on which I grew up on and created my own river. But what I'm showing here is that my mother was trying to inflict these principles, these Christian views and principles, but how I felt inside, I felt ripped, I felt torn apart. I felt I was in the middle of 2 constructs that I couldn't understand. And so this is an example of me showing that frustration, but then yet within that frustration, I'm able to put the piece back together and show you that here's a river, here's the water. And water is heavily used throughout the Bible as well, which it's ironic that, I started out in my practice in my career with my swimming accidents. So So that's it about me. I know I shared a lot, but I wanted to give you guys just a sort of in-depth process of how I think and how I'm able to look at the world and how I'm able to communicate ideas or present constructs that I hope that can transform into something positive, change.
Thank you so much, Charles. So nice to see your work and hear about your process and bring your stories and your history and your family. It's certainly relevant to the programs here. So maybe we can give a round of applause. And we're in the dark, but
No, thank
we
you.
have a big room. I think it's all relevant in terms of the questions that you're asking, that you're posing. About how do we make what's relevant now?
Mhm.
How do we deal with our times, and especially with the students, they're younger and they are like, they're dealing with their times in a different way than
Right.
I. So I mean, how are they going to take this forward seriously, and how to be in touch with history? Because
Yeah. Do you want me to respond to that?
sure. And then before you do,
Okay.
I want to tell everybody else who's not in the room that if you want to ask Charles a question, you can either raise your virtual hand or write it, and then we can call on you, or put it in the Q&A and write it, and we'll take a look at it. And we have students here that might come up and ask a question.
Okay, sounds good.
Go ahead.
What I was thinking about is I have something in my eye, sorry. What I was thinking about is, first of all, what's important to you? What are you trying to say? As a creative, what are you trying to say? How do you want to say it? And what's the best way in doing that? And so, if something that's important, let's just say, you love apples. Well, first of all, let's look at the literal sense of apples, and then let's look at all the associations, and then thirdly, let's go back into some of your own personal experiences with apples to then best decide how to communicate those experiences. Because it's not the actual apple. It's not the actual apple that is what you're trying to get across. It's the emotions, it's the experiences. It's you as the creative wanting to take the viewer from one place to another. It's the psychological journey that you're wanting that person to go along with, because what you're doing when you do that is then you're able to relate, you're able to connect. And we all, as creatives, we want to connect, we want to relate, we want our stories to be heard. And then even so, from after doing that, then you could, well, what is an apple made of? How is it made? And so you can go even further and deeper with that. And then you can actually maybe take an apple and draw with an apple, draw those events, draw the environment with the apple, if you had a positive or negative experience with the apple. So that's sort of like my sort of step by step, I would say, in regards to, to making something important. And then even the other thing is, why is an apple important? What is the, because where you're just using Apple as a vehicle to really share the deeper meaning for what you're trying to say and what you're wanting viewers to experience. So, how is an Apple relevant today? Well, we look at our technology, we look at the computers, we look at, what does an apple from an icon standpoint, what does that represent? Well, thinking, progressive, all these different connotations. And so I think an apple is relatable, and especially, with the younger generation. Oh, by the way, I'll be 39 Sunday. So just throw that in, really excited about that. But just the different associations from an iconic standpoint and technology standpoint, what does the apple represent and show? So that's just my take on how to go about it. And I hope that answers your question and makes sense to the viewers.
So hi, Charles.
Hey, how are you? Good to see you.
Yeah, great to see you. And I'm so happy to see you here at our campus, even if virtually.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I wrote in my question, which is, what's next for you? You've got this prolific body of work and you are
Wow.
so young. Happy early birthday.
Thank
So
you.
yeah, what are you currently thinking on and what can we expect to see from you?
So there's a lot going on. First, so I took a position at North Carolina Central University as chair and painting and drawing professor. So that's exciting. As of, I I think I'm able to share this, but I'm going to share it anyway because I'm excited about it. As of last week, I just got asked to do a commission portrait from the Brooklyn Public Library to paint one of the founders. So I'm super excited about that. I've got a couple of group shows that sprinkled throughout the year. One in Louisiana and Baton Rouge, I'm sorry. And then in the fall, the Black River series that I shared with you from my website, that will be shown at Alabama Contemporary in the fall. So, and hopefully doing something in Switzerland.
I think so.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
Hopefully.
Very
So
nice to see you.
lots of stuff going on. Really blessed and excited. I just, again, like I continue to encourage and share with others to really think about those tender, joyful, peaceful moments and let that spirit come through your work because, we all have something going on or challenging in our lives and so if we can take that time throughout our day, whether it's 15 minutes, whether it's an hour, and then channel that energy, that peaceful place, others will experience it, whether it's in person or whether it's through artwork, whether it's through various mediums. And so that's what I like about the whole aspect of freedom of expression. So yeah, but thank you again for having me, and yeah, feel free to ask more questions.
Thank you so much and
No problem.
congratulations on all the projects coming
Thank
up.
you.
I'll
Thank
end
you.
now.
Thank you.
All right. Hi, we have someone here who would like to ask you a question.
Okay.
I was just wondering if you go back to any of your series and add to them after.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I feel like, and this is just my personal opinion, but us as humans, we are constantly evolving, or we should be evolving. And, how I felt at 21 about a particular subject has changed, or it should change, in my 30s. So what I want to continue to show is that here is one person, myself, going through the process of investigation. And there's just something very rewarding and fulfilling when you're able to sort of look at your strengths and weaknesses. Because then when you come in contact with people, there's sort of like this humble, sort of meek but strong spirit that comes. It's like all at once. And I'm really conscious of that. So when it comes to the Black River series, and by the way, my father and I, we have a great relationship today, as well as my mother. But what I learned from my mother was that when I was going through that, the relationships that I had in my personal life with women, it was hard for me to trust, and men. So I was always guarded. What I learned as well is when it comes to forgiveness, not only I had to forgive my father for the physical aspect, the psychological aspect. And then, so from that investigation, it taught me that, well, who are some other people that, did wrong to you? And like, how can you so I was excited to let that go. Then it was like, okay, who else and what else do I need to let go out of us? And so it was like I was doing self-therapy. Although I had, you know, therapy, but it's like I'm taking therapy to the next step, you know, like I'm literally you know, putting it into practice, you know, as a creative. And so for me, that's I think the most fulfilling aspect about this. And for me, I don't even care about being famous. I really don't. I used to, but that same vein, I said, well, as long as I'm able to share my truth and that's enough for me. So it wasn't until my Sun and Light series that I said, let me leave it open-ended. Like, let me leave it open so I can come back to it. Because there's so many stories and so many, so much that I can share. So yeah, great question. Great question.
Any more questions? Anybody else want to come up? Great, we've got another person that wants to.
Okay.
There's a quick question about, are you open to working as a mentor for those who are trying to break into the art world with similar message comes from someone?
Absolutely. I mean, hey, let me tell you. So now that's a great question because I get excited about this because when I was living in South Carolina, in Charleston, and I was painting nothing but landscapes, I started thinking about my experiences. So I'll just give you the quick cliff notes of it. When I was in high school, I was that kid that was playing with Legos, reading comic books, drawing, and I was around, you know, people who, you know, were in relationships and doing, I thought, the normal things. And I was sort of always like the outcast. And I just learned to, from my high school art teacher, to focus on what I'm good at. And what I realized is that was, and what made me happy. And what made me happy and where I could have a place to escape to was in my artwork. And my high school art teacher literally, and mind you too, I was afraid of color. So I wasn't painting until, you know, I got into undergraduate school. He would I would draw out the scene and he would literally sit there and mix the colors for me. And he would tell me, put blue there, put red there, and then take a brush and blend the two. And so I had constant mentorship and people that helped me along the way. And then he took me to, in my community, the best watercolor artists, right? So to pay for my private art lessons, I worked at the local museum. Like so the gift shop, when people would go in and buy work or buy, you know, objects and items and books and stuff, I was the one to pack them up and ship them. So she was connected to the museum and, you know, I don't know how, but that was my way of paying my dues to learn how to paint. So the way that I paint today still is like a watercolorist. The way I utilize oil is like I'm using watercolor. So from that, my private art teacher, Bruce Chandler, that's her name, she would take me to her competitions and talk to me about business and talk about how to make, you know, money and earn a living and how to, you know, paint authentically. And so she loved jazz. And so she would go to these jazz clubs and places where jazz bands were playing the music, and she would paint them. And so that was her thing. That was her message. That was her love, and she wanted to share her love. So my art teacher, my high school art teacher, Bruce Chandler, my private art teacher, and then my second grade art teacher, who my mom and her are still friends to this day. The three of them got together with me and said, okay, well, Charles, what do you want to do? I said, I want to be an artist. Back then, Savannah College of Art and Design was $36,000. I didn't have the money. My parents didn't have the money. So the three of them and I, the four of us, we went around to different businesses in Georgetown and literally asked them to be able to put my artwork up. So I did 5x7 watercolors. I sold them, on the counter. I had paintings hung on from in the libraries, the banks, the coffee shop, you name it. And, you know, I went to Bruce Chandler, my high school art teacher, second grade art teacher, they went to the local newspaper and they advertised and put in the newspaper that buying my work, all the money would go towards my college fund. And so I had an so at the end of my high school, I had about $17,000, and then I got a couple of scholarships to go to SCAD. But I had this earlier on exposure of that I actually could do this and I could actually make money being an artist. So you would hear the starving artist motto of like, oh, if you're an artist, you're not gonna be able to make money. For me, that wasn't my experience. Even when I was at SCAD, I was going down to River Street down in Savannah and literally, drawing portraits and painting portraits for $20. You know, my mom would ask people in a church while I was at Savannah College of Art and Design if they wanted their portrait drawn. So, $20, $50. And again, I was that student, I couldn't afford, the whole brush set. So I learned how to utilize one or two brushes as if I had the whole set. And so that taught me all of that perseverance and all of that, I thought was, the things that held me back. It actually taught me perseverance. It also taught me technical skills that I still use today in regards to how to hold a brush and why you should hold a brush. And when you paint, it shouldn't just come from your wrist. It should come from, a body, mind, and spirit place. You should be painting from your shoulder. You should be painting from your arms. I teach my students today that the way you hold a brush reflects the sort of line weight that you make. And within the line weight, there's a psychological association with that line weight. And so those experiences helped me to then create a program, which was called a CEW Collaborative. And what I did was, as I went to the museums, I love going to museums, and my mom, she didn't know a lot about art, but she wanted to expose me to art. So she would take me to the museums, and the Gibbes Museum down in Charleston, I reached out to them and said, hey, and this is when I was living in Charleston back in after I graduated from SCAD. I said to them, hey, can I create this program and work with you guys, use your classrooms to wherein I would go to, to Title I schools and, other various schools, private school, public school, to speak to the art teachers and have them work with me one-on-one. And so what I did, I got my collectors, because I was in a gallery in Charleston, I got my collectors to help sponsor a child. And so so if they bought a painting from me, half of the money would go towards paying their lessons, and then the other half would be getting art supplies. So each student that came and worked with me had their own art supplies, and it was really beautiful when I was living there. And I did that for 3 to 4 years. And same students, they still email me. I got into the academy over in Europe. Another one, a scholarship at Chicago Art Institute, and several others. I mean, some of my students have won Scholastic Awards. And again, so it's very fulfilling and rewarding that all of those experiences that I had, I was able to share with them and still be able to share with students today of how to, be the underdog, how to make it in this art world, and do it in a way that's sort of like a farmer type mentality, planting seeds, building relationships, making sure that you foster those relationships, making sure that you do it, but then authentically do it in a way that isn't nagging, begging, and pestering. So for example, I would just make these e-blasts, and I would do it every other month, and I would just call, and I still do this today, but I kind of do it more so to see. It's sort of, I do it in a way that I want to see if I still got it. And I guess, and that might be a wrong way of looking at it, but I still do it. So I'll call, museums, and I'll call curators, and I say, hey, can we set up a time to talk about my work? And a lot of times, 9 times out of 10, the conversations that I have with them, which I'm wanting feedback, I'm wanting critique, I'm wanting their views as a curator. So 9 times out of 10, the response is good. And a lot of times they'll say, hey, well, right now we're booked for a couple of years. So, but it's that special moment that when I get that phone call and say, hey, we cancel a show, or, we have a slot, we want to be able to show your work, or can you come in and do a lecture? And it's just like, wow, like all of those seeds that I planted, all those emails that I sent out, all those phone calls that I sent out, all those e-blasts that I sent out, and doing that consistently, that was me as a farmer planting the seeds and like nourishing the crop and like taking care of it. So all of that I still share, and I'm happy to share with those who contact me. I don't call it mentorship, I just call it part of my duty, part of my purpose. Because like I said, I didn't get here on my own. I'm literally like a product of a community when they come together. I still got people from city council and people that were in office way back when I was in high school and college still reaching out to me and saying, hey, we see that us helping you and even just having your work in our place, how you were able to take that and how successful you are today. So I'm very grateful. So anytime, feel free to reach out to me, shoot me an email, and we'll go from there. We can have Zoom conversations just like this. So.
Thank you.
Okay.
We have someone here I think we have time. We've got 5 minutes for this person wants to ask a question. And then there are some
Okay.
nice questions in the
Okay.
chat just for people to think about, but I think we probably
Okay.
just have time for this one question.
I don't know. I think this one might be too long.
Go ahead.
No, go good.
Okay. Yeah. So, like one of my foundational values is vulnerability, and I like how that you incorporated that so much in there.
Mhm.
And one thing that's kind of stood out to me is how vulnerability is implied to be passive,
Mm,
like intrinsic, because, well, frankly, because the way we treat the most vulnerable in our society.
exactly. Yeah.
And so, like, making it active is kind of a radical expression.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So with that radical expression, like, how do you think you would like juxtapose or superpose it with the implied intrinsic nature of the most vulnerable?
We have to be a siren. We gotta be bold about it. We have to take those things that we care about that are so precious and make it known that this is why you should look at it. This is why you should investigate it. And if the way that we do that is by investigating it ourselves, so when we look at vulnerability, yes, it has this connotation of like, oh, passive, but the way that you are able to communicate it and the strength in that, the longer that you take to investigate it from a vulnerable place, authentic place, and to investigate it deeper than just the surface, that makes it actually come to life and gives it that strong pillar, so others can see this is why this needs to be a dialogue. So for me, I'll just use my work and my story. It's so important that I share these hidden stories that have been a part of all of our history, but more so importantly within African American history, because it was gutted out of this public school system, and what if we had this information, how much more united would we be? And I'm not talking within African American race, I'm talking about every culture. I'm talking about every background. And on top of that, we understand that, well, I'll say I understand later on that race, that's just a social construct. That's just something it was something that was built to, to be, to put fear, and to separate and segregate. And it's just like, if we move that aside, then we could really see the truth. And so I look at myself as an avenger or, mad scientist. You look at Spider-Man. Spider-Man has all these powers, but, he's a kid, but he's powerful. And he was able to say to himself, okay, I have to leave or not be with Mary Jane in order to fight for the greater cause of saving the world. And now he really loved Mary Jane, but he also saw the greater importance of what Uncle Ben said is, you know, with great power comes responsibility. So that's how we as creatives have to look at it. It's like, we are like mutants. We can create something out of nothing. We have our own voice. And if we stay strong and consistent and investigate it to every possible degree, then it does become powerful. And that's how I would suggest going about doing that. I hope that answers your question.
All right.
Actually, one really quick follow-up question. How come
Yes.
don't like paint their offices? You're
Say it one more
already-
time. I'm sorry. One more time.
Wait. Hold on. Go ahead.
Okay. What did you say? I'm sorry.
Yeah, so yeah, I asked like, why don't painters like paint their offices? You're already at work and that's your job. Is
You know what? I don't know. I find it, yeah, I noticed that too.
don't know
But I
why
think,
it's not
I
coming
think,
here.
I think, I'll just say for me, you know, I'm grateful just to have a space to paint, that I'm so conscious and thinking about, like, it's like breathing, like I gotta paint. It's like I gotta eat, like I gotta express myself, I gotta explore, I gotta play with paint, you know. And so for me, as a warm up, you know, just like if you're exercising or you want to warm up, you know, your body so you can avoid injury, I just come in the studio for about 5-10 minutes. I play some jazz, or I play my favorite songs, and I just play with paint, and I just sort of test myself and mixing a bunch of colors and temperatures and seeing what sort of colors can I make. And sometimes I'll use those colors as like studies, you know, just to play around. And then, you know, I mean, you know, as far as a creative, once you get in that zone, that pocket wherein you're actually just having conversation, it's like you're not even thinking, you're just having this dialogue with the medium, you know. And that's a beautiful spot. That's a beautiful place, because that's when everything comes alive. And also the viewers, you know, if you stay in that place, the longer you stay in that place, the spirit comes out in the work. So
That's nice. That's,
yeah.
I think that's a nice place to leave us, to remember
Yeah. Yeah.
spirit in the work.
Yeah.
And I just want to thank you so much for
Well, thank you.
today.
Thank you.
Maybe we can get you to visit again. It was very nice.
Anytime. I
All
would
right.
love to come out
All
there.
right.
Yes.
All
All
right.
right.
Take care. Happy birthday.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.